So there is this section of the sidewalk that you're going to walk past when you start at exit D of the central MTR station. And I'm sure everyone has been around this area before, and you'll probably see representatives from different nonprofit organizations roaming around trying to catch busy Hong Kong citizens asking for donations or responses to short surveys. And when you look around, you'll probably see people rushing around past these representatives, responding with a hasty, "Oh, no, I don't have time for this," before walking really quickly into the station or avoiding eye contact entirely. And a typical thought process that might go through someone's brain might be something like, "Ooh, that looks interesting. Oh, but I only have 3 minutes. And what can I really do in 3 minutes? I won't be able to save a dog or preserve an iceberg or save a child. Oh, well. Oh no, that person just made eye contact with me. Time to look away and walk faster." So I know that we can't see the show of hands, and I was hoping that I would be able to see people's show of hands, but it's okay. But I just wanted you to think a little bit about whether you've ever been in a situation like this, where you thought to yourself, what difference can I really make? And then walked away. And here I'm not trying to make anyone feel guilty or ashamed. My intention is actually to showcase and to highlight how common this behavior actually is. Creating change can feel really daunting, and especially when the tasks are really complicated or seem really complicated or seem like, things that we can't do alone, it can feel really daunting to even start or approach that idea of creating change. So this question of what difference can I really make can stop us in our tracks before we even begin. And the central MTR example that I gave right at the start is an example. It's just one example of how this questioning of our change-making abilities can affect our behaviors. And there are many more spaces in our lives where this questioning can exert its impact. And I've certainly seen the effects of this question in my work. So as the founder of Body Banter, which is a youth mental health organization that tackles issues and conversations surrounding body image and mental health, and currently as a PhD student exploring the role of culture and language in shaping perceptions of mental health and mental illness in the Hong Kong community, I've seen how a person's approach to creating change can be the difference between staying silent and inspiring and invigorating an entire community. So in today's talk, I'd like to shed light on what I call the active ingredients of change making. And these active ingredients, I like to think of them as like the yeast in bread. We often don't discuss the very significant role that this yeast plays in helping the bread rise and form, but we certainly miss it when we don't add it in. And yes, I speak from personal experience of having forgotten to add yeast into my bread and very literally ending up with flat bread. So the active ingredients I'm going to be talking about today will be more informed by my research and advocacy work within the mental health space, but I'd like to invite all of you to think about how these ingredients can also help activate and formulate your change-making abilities in whatever space you might choose, in whatever space that you resonate with. So let's get right on into it. The first active ingredient to creating change is recognizing that your personal well-being is a key factor in ensuring the effectiveness and the sustainability of your change-making work. So oftentimes I think that we see change-making as an external process, something that we do for other people outside of ourselves. And I think when we see change-making in this light, it can often lead us to engage in one of two kinds of behaviors. For some people, it leads us to shy away from even considering taking the first step, which is what we saw in the MTR example right at the start. And for other people, it can lead us to get so involved in our change-making efforts that we completely forget to take care of ourselves in the process. Let's say pulling an all-nighter just to finish some tasks that we are finishing up for a volunteer position at an organization that we're working with. But as the saying goes, you can't change the world overnight. And that means and really speaks to the idea that creating change requires persistence and it requires patience. It certainly helps to have that element of passion for our cause, for the things that we're supporting, because it motivates us to be consistent in our efforts. but it also really matters that we ourselves are physically and mentally well enough to persist in those efforts. So using the analogy of a car, you can have the fastest model in the entire world and still not be able to move an inch if you have no fuel loaded into it. So again, tying it back to that passion, right? We can have all of the things that we need, but then still not be able to move because we don't have that energy inside of us. We need that energy and the resources within us to be able to act on our passion consistently over time. And my ongoing research on mental health in the Hong Kong community really supports this idea. Specifically, my analysis of a recent population survey conducted in 2021 showed that the better the respondents' self-reported mental health status, the higher their likelihood of endorsing positive attitudes toward people with mental illness in the community. And in other words, what these findings really suggest is that when we ourselves are in a robust state of well-being, we are much more able to free up the mental capacity to care about other people's needs as well. And taking care of your own well-being is a key ingredient in change making, because you have to think about it as you are the source of change. You are the source from which the river flows, right? And once you start to see the change-making process as something that is personally relevant, something that necessarily involves you and requires your well-being to be carried out effectively, you can further nurture your passion for this cause because you see yourself as intricately involved in that picture and making a difference. And you also make sure that your work can be sustained over the long term. Okay, we're going to get right on into the second active ingredient, which is acknowledging that small changes can make a really big difference. And I think when we imagine the word change, we often think about something that's really dramatic, really noticeable, and really fast occurring. After all, this is what we see in the superhero movies, right? Where the protagonist swoops in and saves the planet within seconds. And it really is no wonder that we've come to think of change as this really glamorous and flashy event. But as we've discussed in the previous point, creating change in real life is much more about patience and persistence than it is about speed and suspense. It is much more like a marathon than it is like a sprint. And what this means is that the magic is really in the details. The ways that we act intentionally in daily settings has the capacity to eventually accumulate into something much, much greater. And there's a really awesome example from the field of mental health that I like to bring up, and that's the power of changing the ways that we talk about people with mental illness in our daily conversations. So in a 2016 study, researchers asked their participants to read two different stories. In the first story, the main character of the story was described as the person or described as the mentally ill. And in the second story, this main character was described as the person with mental illness. And so after reading one of these stories, the respondents were all asked to fill out a measure of tolerance toward individuals with mental illness in the community. And what the researchers found from this study is that the people who were presented with the first scenario, where the person in the story was labeled as the mentally ill, endorsed greater prejudicial attitudes toward individuals with mental illness in the community, lower feelings of kindness toward individuals with mental illness, and a lower likelihood of supporting the idea of people with mental illness being integrated into the community. On the contrary, people who were presented with the second scenario, where the main character was labeled the person with mental illness, these people were much more likely to endorse positive and tolerant attitudes toward people with mental illness in the community, and were much more likely to support the integration of these individuals into the community as well. So what these findings really say and really suggest is that these seemingly insignificant details, like changing the language we use, changing the words we use to describe someone, can truly make a world of a difference, even if it may not be immediately evident. So simply by changing the words, right, by using our words to indicate that people who experience mental health conditions are not their illness, they're not their condition, they're people who experience these conditions. When we show that at the level of language, we affect the people around us. We allow them to listen and to hear that message. And this creates a domino effect. It allows these people around us to transfer the message to the people around them, who then transfer that message to more and more people around them as well. And so trusting the power of consistent and intentional actions in our daily life, I think of it like zooming out from a very, very pixelated image and then seeing the full-bodied picture in its magnificent entirety. A single pixel might not be anything remarkable, but the collection of pixels can become something incredible. Okay, and we're here at the final active ingredient of change making that I'd like to talk about today. And that is recognizing that change making can be a creative process. In other words, your version of change making does not need to look like anyone else's in order to be impactful and important. When we decide to try something new or do something that we've never done before, we often look to examples of how they've been done in the past. This is really natural. It's a human tendency when we're learning new things. For example, we might then again look at the superhero movies and think to ourselves, hey, creating change looks like flying around and saving people. Or perhaps we look at other ways of more mundane forms of change making, such as volunteering at a shelter or giving a speech in front of a large group of people or becoming a social media influencer with gazillions of followers. And this is not to say that any of these forms of change making are wrong or different or that we can't engage in them ourselves. But it is to say that our versions of change making don't necessarily have to look like these versions that we frequently see. And we have not failed in our missions or failed to do enough just because our versions of change making don't look like what we see frequently. And an underappreciated fact, I think, about the change making process is that it is necessarily individualized. When we tie back to our first and second active ingredients, we really need to find a mission that we personally feel passionate about and that we also have the time and the energy for, so that we can engage in our efforts effectively and sustainably. To create meaningful change over time, it's really important to look to ourselves, to come back to ourselves, to reflect on what resources we have available to us and what generates sparks in our hearts. I'll give you an example from my work with Body Banter. So when I work with the young people that form our community, I encourage them to explore different aspects or different formats of change making. And I ask them, hey, what medium of expression feels most aligned with you? And with every person I work with, I find myself pleasantly surprised and inspired by the different ways that each person chooses to carry out their mission. I've watched members of our community do everything from starting discussion groups at their schools, to writing blog posts, to creating artwork, to planning social media campaigns, to filming vlogs and recording podcast episodes. Importantly, these mediums of change making are chosen based on what feels personally meaningful to these people and what is currently also feasible for them in terms of time and in terms of energy. Instead of trying to fit a certain pre-established cookie cutter mold of what change making should look like, our youth advocates ask themselves what change making could look like. And I'll share a more specific example of a really inspiring project that 3 of our current youth ambassadors have actually created. Amelia, Jasmine, and Zoe, shout out since they are also actually CIS students, teamed up to create the Society's Secrets podcast, which explores how societal influences shape our approach to body image and mental health issues. And their podcast is a mix of personal experience sharing and interviews. And during our monthly catch-ups, they've shared with me how creating these episodes not only helps spread a message that they believe in, but also helps remind themselves to take care of their own mental health. As you can imagine, they're busy students, much like most of you are in the audience. But by planning ahead and creating all of these episodes in a season before releasing them, they're able to consistently produce high quality content. And this approach of carrying out a project consistently and intentionally is one that I personally struggled with in high school. I really did see change making as a really black and white task where I was either going to do nothing or change the entire world. And so it's really encouraging to me to see the young people that I work with today doing what they can with the time and the energy that they have. So to end, I'd like to go right on back to the beginning, to that story about the Central MTR. You don't have to stop every time you walk through that busy area of Central, but you might consider talking to one person, asking for the website to learn more about one cause, or even just taking a leaflet. You might take a moment to consider whether this cause is personally meaningful to you. And perhaps if you do have the time, thinking about ways that you might be able to contribute to this cause with relative consistency. So the bottom line is, you're probably not going to preserve an iceberg or save a dog or feed a child overnight. But you are going to be able to take a step in reversing that belief in your head, telling you that you can't possibly make a meaningful difference simply by paying attention and engaging intentionally with the world around you. You will come to realize that perhaps what the world needs is not more people doing what is expected of them, but more people doing what is exciting to them. You're going to be becoming someone that believes in the power of their own voice, allowing your river to flow into the ocean so that we can make waves together. Thank you.